And I think I'm going to be haunted by this photograph for the rest of my life. Thank you guys for using it. So this is the great beyond. Mankind, humankind, have always been defined by the limitations that we place upon ourselves. They fix who we are in the world and how we interact with the world. They shape us and they make us who we are. Indeed, our very conception of the world around us has long been decided, has long been based on the limitations that we place on that world. In the very earliest maps of the planet, the ancient Babylonians conceived of a world of 7 regions, with Babylon at its center, and a third region, which was described as the one where even the winged bird ends not its flight. Even the birds did not go to this third region. All beyond the second region was unknown and unknowable. Centuries later, the ancient Greeks produced maps of the world which, interestingly, show a spherical world surrounded by Oceanus, the divine personification of the sea, the mighty river beyond which nobody could make any passage. That which lay beyond Oceanus was also unknown and unknowable. In the Middle Ages, many people believed that the earth was flat and that to venture too far out to sea risked sailing right over the very edge of the earth itself. Maps of distant lands abound with strange and fantastical creatures of all kinds. There are the sciapods, which are human-like creatures with just one enormous foot, which they used, naturally, to shade from the sun. There were the blemi, a race of creatures lacking heads and whose facial features were located instead on their chests. And then we have the kynocephali, a dog-faced, human-like race of creatures who lived on the very edges, the very limits of the map themselves. And here be monsters indeed. And yet these creatures, fantastical as they are not merely the product of some overly stimulated medieval imagination, but are like Oceanus and the third region to which even the birds do not fly, a representation of our limitations in the world. They are metaphors for the unknown and the unknowable. And yet, uniquely for the creatures of the earth, limitations have not merely served in the imagination of mankind as barriers beyond which there is no passage, but they have also, and paradoxically, served as totems of what lies beyond, of what could be known, of what could be knowable. The limitations conceived by the minds of humans have long had the effect of a siren call on the imaginations of humans, seducing, calling, tempting the intrepid, the adventurous, even the merely reckless into going beyond the limits, into going beyond and seeing what could be known and what could be knowable. They have, in this way, acted as agents of their own destruction, but they've also affected a profound influence on the human psyche. Tens of thousands of years ago, a small group of Homo sapiens stood on the eastern shore of the Red Sea, separating Africa from Asia. This was a group of people with only the most rudimentary of tools, staring across a significant sea strait into the unknown and the unknowable. What lay beyond? What lay over the horizons? They could have had no possible conception of what lay beyond the limits. They could not even have known necessarily that there was another landmass in the world other than their own. For them, what we now call Africa was the world. They were on the very rim of the world, standing there, staring out at Oceanus with no idea of what lay beyond the limits. And then they stepped forward, and they crossed into Asia. And what made them do it? Part of it, I think, lies in the human enthrallment with boundaries and our conception of them both as impermeable barriers and as gateways to the great beyond. And in that sense, what lies beyond may have been unknown, but has never truly been unknowable. Now, the same motif runs not merely through human history, but it is a key theme in the literature of every culture and society. In the Odyssey, the hero Odysseus travels to the underworld, a feat, a journey that is repeated 2,000 years later when Dante travels to purgatory and hell and is guided through the nether regions by the great Roman writer Virgil. In the ancient Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh, the eponymous king transcends the veil of the world and in doing so is reconciled with his own mortality. The ancient Jews posited that Adam and Eve, the progenitors of mankind, were flung from the paradisical Garden of Eden because they had sought to transcend one of the ultimate knowledges. They had become one of the ultimate limits. They had sought to become as God by eating of an apple from the tree of knowledge. The early Christians, who adopted many of these stories into their own canon, sought to go beyond the ultimate limit, They sought to transcend death itself. Christ died for our sins, and in doing so, the limit of limits was itself reached. In a very real sense then, our conceptions of limits have long transcended our actual definition of limits, of ultimate boundaries beyond which there is no passage. In 1492, Christopher Columbus transcended the limits, indeed transcended Oceanus itself in reaching the New World. Over 60 years ago, Roger Bannister was the first man to breach the 4-minute mile. In 1996, scientists in Scotland went further beyond the limits of genetic endeavor than anyone before in history when they developed Dolly the sheep, the world's first cloned mammal. And this pushing of the boundaries has long been celebrated, and in many instances such celebrations are worthy. The allure of going beyond the limits has spurred humankind into the most fantastic of achievements in every field of endeavor, in the scientific and technological development, in literature and the arts, in how we organize ourselves politically and socially. The allure of going beyond the limits has made us who we are. And yet a look at who we are should posit that a look at who we are, where we have come from, should posit enough evidence that the transcending of the limits is not in and of itself always a wholly positive thing. Columbus discovered the New World, yes, and in doing so he opened the gates to pillaging, subjection, and genocide on a scale unprecedented in human history before or since. Bannister ran the mile in under 4 minutes, it's true, but the desire, the need to emulate his achievements has led to a fundamental crisis in sports in general, as athletes of every stripe and affiliation increasingly turn to performance-enhancing drugs to go beyond, to achieve the unachievable. The cloning of Dolly the sheep was unprecedented, fair enough, and pushing the boundaries in such a manner did usher in an era in which the cutting-edge genetic research is increasingly being used to solve and to treat a whole range of human and environmental ills. And yet, the recent revelation that a Chinese scientist, He Jiankey, had edited the genes of 2 unborn twins shocked the world and caused considerable controversy over the ethics of such approach. Now, the capacity of humans to go beyond the limitations of the everyday is both truly remarkable and often truly inspirational. And yet, in transcending the limits in one sphere of activity, we so often and paradoxically limit ourselves in another sphere. In Japan, for example, there has been an unprecedented spike in recent years in the divorce rate amongst older couples. Known as retired husband syndrome, it is attributed to the fact that after spending decades dedicating themselves to their jobs and pushing the boundaries in their chosen profession, white-collar workers or salarymen retire to spend life and time with a family and with wives they realize they have barely any connection with. They have spent their lives pushing their limits in the one area, only to discover too often too late they have circumscribed themselves in the personal and the familial. In the same country, there's the concept of karoshi, or death by overwork, in which the transcending of the professional limits literally results in the circumscription of the mortal limits. And this is not confined to any one country or region. The inadvertent limiting of ourselves in the pursuit of pushing through boundaries is a global phenomenon, and not one that is confined to the realms of adults. In schools all around the world, there's a marked drop-off in the number of students participating in sports and other extracurricular activities once they reach a certain level of education. These students literally limit their health, their fitness, and their enjoyment of life and their determination to push the boundaries of education and of pushing the boundaries of their grades. In doing so, they're often encouraged and applauded by their parents and by their teachers. In this school, it is not uncommon for even middle school students to arrive exhausted in the morning after staying up until 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. studying or revising. When I ask high school students how they spend their holidays, the response is often that they don't have holidays. They either studied at home or they went to the ubiquitous academy. Their pleasure and experience of life is circumscribed so that the academic limits can be pushed back and breached. This is not and cannot be a healthy thing. Ironically, it is often this case that students limit themselves in such a manner in order to achieve the expectations placed on themselves by others, seemingly unaware that these expectations are in themselves limiting. Now, like all the creatures of the earth, human beings have always been limited. There are boundaries which we cannot or dare not step. What makes us unique is not just our awareness of these boundaries, but our reaction to them. They are not fixed and impermeable like they are for other creatures, but both points on both the mental and physical horizon, which not only encroach upon us, but which call us forward, calling us into the breach and beyond. And this has made us who we are, the most transcendent of all creatures. It has given us dominion over the world. It has opened us up to new and wonderful possibilities and allowed us to make sense of our own condition, both in an individual and a collective sense. And yet, in passing beyond the limits, we so often end up facing the reality of that most innate of limitations, that of the human condition itself. Thus, the transcending of earthly margins and discovery of new countries and new lands fails to bring about a corresponding unfolding in our mortality, in our morality. Indeed, there is an actual diminishment in that morality, an essential facet of the human condition. Thus, in striving for the beyond in our academic and professional endeavors, we truncate the expression of ourselves in other aspects of our lives, in the personal, the social, and the familial. We progress in one area, but we regress in another. What is needed, perhaps, is a recalibration of our relationship with limits, an understanding that if we are to grow and progress in a manner more full and fulfilled, in a manner more comprehensive and compartmentalized, we need to abandon our fixation on reaching individual boundaries and contemplate instead how we push the boundaries of the human condition in all its totality. How we can transcend not the individual limits, but rather how we can transcend the limitations of the human condition. It's not an easy task, but it's an essential task if we are to grow, to live in harmony in the world, not just with the world itself, but with ourselves. Thank you all.